everyone. Take number 2 of Thomas's hot takes on trucking earnings. Thomas, thank you for coming back with us once again. Apparently, your hot takes were too much for air because it kicked us off right as you were about to get started. But let's talk about it. Knight-Swift and Covenant both dropping earnings, and the common theme is the freight market continues to be weak, as if we didn't already know that.
It definitely is, and it's not a surprise. We'd seen stuff, even Morgan Stanley and other analysts do some adjustments saying, well, it may be worse than what we originally thought. Now, remember, an analyst, you always want to be a little more rosy and optimistic because you don't get invited. They won't come to your investor conferences. So make sure that, you can't be too much of a bear about the situation. But the fun one is Covenant because when I'm going through this, I thought to myself, well, I could regurgitate earnings per share and all this other silly nonsense, or I could do what I do, which is dig through their information and see what they're trying to do with their equipment and assets, because that's the really fun part. It's kind of like parsing between the lines or reading the freight tea leaves, so to speak.
So Thomas, let's talk about it, because coming out of that, Covenant actually posted their second best quarter ever when it came to, I believe it was their EBITDA number. So that shows that things are good on all rosy on the headline making numbers, right? But as you said, you parse through some of those details. Is that a false sense of security for what they're reporting in their headline numbers versus what's actually happening in the kind of the middle of their books?
Well, when looking at it, one big thing for trucking executives, it's all about the OR. It's one of the big holy grail numbers, and they were hovering right around, I think, around 90 to, adjusted OR. They actually had some improvement. They went from adjusted in their dedicated 96.2 to 91.4. And when I'm looking at their expedited, which is part of their truckload as well, you're looking at teams. So their combined truckload actually was around that 91 hash mark as well. So you want to kind of parse that out. Typically, trucking is low margins. If you're like 85, you're doing really good. If you're around 90, that's kind of, you're performing well. You're making 10%. And then, when I was at US Express, it'd be like 95 to 100. You don't want to be there because you actually make some money. But looking at their fleet information, they also had some financial statistics. This is what's fascinating. Seated team units. So that's one where it's hard to seat teams compared to solo drivers because you're putting two strangers frequently in a tiny box and one sleeps and the other drives. So we saw improvement. So when we're looking in between the lines of why are they so upbeat and optimistic, even though it's still rough out there, was that it's easier to find drivers. They went from 38.2% to 42.4%. You're thinking, why is that a big deal? Well, it means more of them stuck around and it was easier to find them. And then age of tractors, we talked about record Class 8 sales. Folks were buying equipment all throughout 2023. Well, their average age of their tractor went from 2.1 years to 1.6. So we know that they were able to buy more equipment, and their trailer age went down 6.2 to 5.9 years. So that's a few things that tells me large fleets were finally able to buy all the stuff they need. And then looking at open trucks, you don't usually see a working tractor percentage, but 4% of open trucks, which means maybe unseated or wrecked, compared to 5.7% last year. So that tells me two things. One, you can either reseat the asset and have drivers come in. So, I don't have as many open seat trucks parked on the back of the fence. Or two, we talked about over the past 2 or 3 years, issues with getting parts, equipment, labor shortages for repairs. Well, seeing that their open truck percentages, including wrecks, went down also shows that in the event something happens to the assets, you can assume now that there's not a big bottleneck on getting parts. So it's easier to get assets and it's easier to repair assets. So it's kind of a good sign moving into 24, but also it means that if their average age per tractor is lower, they're probably not going to be buying a bunch more trucks than they usually do, historically prior to the pandemic. So the big boom, so to speak, of Class 8s is going to have to come elsewhere, overseas or private fleets is what we're seeing right now.
So, Thomas, I'm curious about that open truck percentage in the context of this perceived driver shortage that we talk about. Is that a metric that something could be particularly useful when you're talking about hiring and the employment practices in a company? We know that employment numbers aren't necessarily great when it comes to equating employment to driver, but if you're talking about butts in seats, which is what that open truck percentage equates to, right? That could be a good metric for if we're actually seeing a shortage of drivers or not, depending on your carrier.
Well, I think it's a good shortage to see how labor responds, driver labor, the labor pool. When rates get good, drivers go from large fleets to smaller fleets. They typically, if they stick around, will leave a larger carrier to get a smaller one because there's more attention, better pay, better quality of life. But when large carriers have trouble finding drivers, it's typically because their business model is a high turnover one. We talk about the 95% to 105% turnover. So, in the context of a driver shortage, it's kind of like saying I run a chicken processing facility, and there's some shortages in the amount of chicken available to process. That's how the sausage gets made, so to speak. So, yeah, I think that having a driver shortage narrative is useful if you are a large fleet and you have a systemic business model that increases turnover. But it's important to remember that not all fleets have this problem. Your smaller fleets, your private fleets, LTL carriers. And so I think it's disingenuous when we when we hear about this driver shortage talk, because it is just really isolated into this small subset. There is a shortage for them, but it is a turnover related thing. It's a business model. So we call it a driver shortage. Imagine we have a really inefficient diesel engine and we keep saying we need to put more fuel in it. Well, it's only 3.5 miles per gallon. We could design a better engine, but it works. It's gotten us there for the past 40 years. And then there's other companies saying, well, I can make a 10 mile per gallon engine. So it's the same way in terms of driver labor pool being used and expended. So it's fascinating. I like looking at this because, open trucks, including wrecks, if we do see this number go up and the market improves, that means that they are needing to do more incentives to get new drivers into the bucket, or maybe there's issues down the pipeline where these drivers are making other decisions, picking other companies. Covenant's a unique case. It is team driving. They have a dedicated component. They prefer to not have solo drivers. They do primarily for truckload team expedite. So I would look also if we can find things Knight Swift and a few others. It's very rare that they put an open tractor. They don't like to talk about working tractor because, when we talk about tender rejection rates may be at 5%, but maybe I've had a rough week. My working tractor may be at 90%. So, there's always an internal fungibility of available truckload capacity within a carrier itself. They don't want you to know about it because they're going to service fail freight. And if you actually knew their actual tractor percentage, then you may purposely tender them less to match their needs. And they just wouldn't make any money that way.
So, Thomas, when it comes to your show from this week and your newsletter, Loaded and Rolling, what can the people expect from that? More deep dives into the earnings?
We actually had cybersecurity. Antoine Banks with NMFTA was on. A super fun one, getting to talk about that. It's one of those things where trucking companies have historically not thought their stuff was important. But now with the rise in cargo theft, cybersecurity, and penetration attacks and everything, there's a lot going on. So I think that, we're starting to see a situation where thieves could theoretically hack into your system, gain access to your customer information, find out where you're picking up your Red Bulls, and then they can park outside. They'll know the assets, they'll know the telematics data, they can follow the truck. I mean, it does open a whole new world where basically now these API systems, all the freight tech that has helped us, which is very good, allowing us to communicate, can also harm us. One fun thing was Target's hack came from one of their third-party vendors with an API. I think it was an AC vendor or something. So even if you have good policies, maybe your customer or somebody else or a broker or a carrier or somebody else that you work with that has an API access can actually be the problem. And then, they're going to backdoor into your organization. So, we're starting to see over the past years that thieves are paying more attention to it. We always hear about the double brokering. But these schemes are getting really clever just because, there is really a black market for these stolen goods and there's a lot of demand. So, unfortunately, criminal enterprises, they have the word enterprise in it. They're going to try to expand markets and, robbing a pallet or two from a dry van trailer if you need to get some Red Bull or some beverages. I'm not pointing out Red Bull in general, just usually energy drinks are also really popular and snack foods. I know it's weird, but these things are things you want to pay attention to.
All right, Thomas. Well, of course, we can find that episode up on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast, and we will catch up with you next week.
Always a pleasure.